everyone. Today we will explore the foundational concepts of CSS. By the end of this session, you will understand how to style web pages and apply CSS effectively. Let's get started. Now in this slide, we will be introducing CSS. CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, is a language used to style the presentation of a web page. It handles everything related to how the web page looks, including layout, colors, fonts, and more. The key advantage of CSS is that it separates content written in HTML from presentation. This makes it easier to update and maintain websites' designs, especially on large websites. For example, we can change the layout of an entire site by modifying a single CSS file without touching the HTML structure. Now, what is CSS syntax? CSS syntax is a structure that defines how styles are applied. It's made up of three key parts. The first one is selector. This targets the HTML element that we want to style. Then the other one is property. Property defines the aspect of the element to be styled, like color or font size. Then the last one is value, that is the actual style you want to apply. Here is the example. By reviewing this example, you can see the first one here, the selector is h1. Then the properties are color and font size. And then the last one, the values are blue and 24 pixels. The result is that all h1 elements will have blue text with a font size of 24 pixels. Then in this slide, we will be studying the types of CSS. There are three ways to apply CSS to a web page. Among them, the first one is Inline CSS. Then the second one is internal Embedded CSS. And the last one is external CSS. Each method has its own pros and cons, but external CSS is the most scalable and widely used in large projects. Now we will study the first type of CSS, that is Inline CSS. Inline CSS is applied directly to an HTML element through the style attribute. This method is useful for quick styling of individual elements. The first, as you can see in the example, the style only applies to this particular h1 element, making it a fast but non-scalable solution for larger websites. Now, for the pros and cons of this inline CSS the pros are it is quick to apply for individual elements and there is no need for an external style sheet. Then the cons are it's not reusable. You must repeat the style for each element. And this makes the HTML code harder to maintain and more cluttered. Overall, inline CSS is best for one-off styles or minor tweaks, but is impractical for larger projects. Now the next one is internal embedded CSS. Internal CSS is written within a style tag in the head section of an HTML document. This method is useful when you want to style a single HTML page. Now we will be reviewing example of an internal embedded CSS. As you can see in this example, the style applies only to the h1 element on this particular page without affecting other pages. And in this example, the h1 element will have blue text with a font size of 24 pixels. This style applies only to the specific h1 element, as you can see. Now for the pros and cons of the internal CSS. The pros are it's easier to manage than inline CSS for a single document. Keeps the styling separate from content, although it's still in the same file. Then the cons are not reusable across multiple pages. can make the head section of an HTML document complex if there are styles. While internal CSS is better than inline CSS for a single page styling, it's not efficient for multi-page websites. And lastly, we will be studying external CSS. External CSS is the most scalable way to apply styles across a website. CSS is stored in a separate CSS.css file, which is linked to HTML document using the link tag. Now, for the example of the external CSS, as you can see, in this case, the styles for h1 and p are defined in the external style.css file, which is and applied to all HTML files that is linked to it. Now, for the pros and cons of the external CSS, the pros are it's reusable across multiple HTML pages, then keeps the HTML file clean and separate and separates styles from content. And make it easier to maintain and update the design across a large website. The cons are requires an additional extra file, which means more HTTP requests and when loading the web page is installed. Then styles won't apply if the CSS file is not correctly linked or it is missing or either the case. Now we will be studying CSS selectors. CSS selectors define which element on the page the style will apply to. The most common selectors are, the first one is universal selector. It targets all the elements on the page. Then the second one is element selector. Targets all instances of a specific HTML element like P or H1. Then the third one is class selector. Targets elements with a specific class attribute. The fourth one is the ID selector. It targets a unique element with a specific ID. Then the last one is attribute selector. Targets elements based on the presence or value of an attribute. Now we will study the first selector, that is universal selector. The universal selector represented by an asterisk applies styles to every element to the page. As you can see in the example, this resets the margin and padding for all elements to 0, which is a common technique when starting from scratch with CSS. Now we will be studying type selectors, mainly called as elementor selectors. Type selectors target all instances of a particular HTML element. Like as you can see in the example, this rule applies blue text to every paragraph P element on the page. It's useful when you want to apply consistent styles to all elements of the same page. Then the next one is a class selector. We can write it as a dot class, then what is our class names and all. Class selector targets elements that have a specific class attribute. It's denoted by a dot followed by the class name. As you can see in the example, any element with the highlight class will have a yellow background. Classes are reusable, so you can apply this style to multiple elements. As you can see, you can define the class in the paragraph text like class highlight, and you can use this in the CSS like dot highlight, then what you want the background color and all. Now we will be studying ID selectors. ID selectors targets a unique element on the page using an ID attribute. The ID must be unique within the document, and the selector is written with a hash. As you can see in the example, this rule applies a 24 pixel font size to the element with the ID header. Since IDs are unique, this selector is only used when you need to style a specific element. And in the HTML, in the division tag, you will write ID, then you will write the unique ID name header, and for the end in the CSS, and then in the CSS file, you will use hash header, then start writing your code. Now, the last one but not least is the attribute selector. Attribute selectors applies styles to element based on specific attributes when they have. In this example, as you can see, this tool applies red text to all the anchor A elements that have an half attribute. Attribute selectors are useful when you want to style elements conditionally based on their attributes. Now, we will be studying CSS properties. CSS Properties defines how HTML elements should be styled. Some of the most common categories of CSS properties includes text properties, box model properties, then background properties, and the last one is display properties. For the text properties, it includes color, font size, text align, line heights, and etc. For the box model, it's margin, padding, border, width, and height. For the background properties, it's like background color, background image, background position, and all. And for the display, it's like display, visibility, and all the other things. Now we will be studying example of a basic CSS. In this example, as you can see, first we have used paragraph. First we have style for paragraph P. In that, first we have used color for the text color, then font on which size, we want, then line height for line spacing, means space between lines, and lastly margin creates a space outside the element, separating it from the other elements. Then we have used box selector. In that, we have used width, which sets the width of the box element when padding creates. Then padding creates a space between its content and its border. Then for border, it creates a 2 pixel size of border and a solid border. Then lastly, background color for the background of the box element. That wraps up our introduction to CSS. We have covered the basics of styling web pages using CSS, including selectors, properties, and the box model. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this session has given you a solid foundation to start building your own style web pages. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And thanks again.